All right, so let's talk about something that, I'm sure a lot of people have thought about, especially if you're trying to like figure out relationships these days. What does the Bible actually have to say about sex before marriage? I mean, you hear all sorts of different opinions out there, right? Some people are really adamant that it's completely off limits, and then others are kind of like, well, I don't know, the Bible doesn't exactly come out and say no in so many words, so it can be a bit of a head scratcher.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, when you actually start digging into this topic, you find that even people who spend their lives studying the Bible have some pretty different perspectives on it. You'll have some folks who will tell you flat out that there's no rule against it. And then others who will say that if you look at the whole picture, like the principles behind the rules and the whole culture of biblical times, it's actually pretty clear what the answer is.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today, right? You sent over this super interesting article from Sophizo, and it's by Ian Paul. It was published pretty recently, like just this past January 19th, 2025. It's called "Does the Bible Prohibit Sex Before Marriage?" And it really gets into like the Jewish background of the whole thing, what the Old Testament laws actually say, what the New Testament teaches, and how all of that connects to how we think about relationships now. I mean, times have changed, right?
Right, a lot. And, our goal here isn't to, tell anyone what to believe or anything like that, but we do want to take a good hard look at what the Bible actually says, and maybe just as importantly, what it doesn't directly say about having sex before you get married.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll be working with this article as kind of our roadmap, and we'll even touch on some of the comments people have made about it because those bring up some really good points too.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's go way back first to the Jewish perspective and what was going on in the Old Testament, like in terms of customs. This article makes this really interesting point that from a Jewish standpoint, the Bible doesn't actually have a clear-cut black and white thou shalt not when it comes to premarital sex. At least not when we're talking about a man and a woman who are actually planning to get married. It seems like back then it was more of a social thing, like going against the normal way of doing things, rather than an actual legal offense that would get you in huge trouble with the law. So you're saying that the big takeaway here isn't so much about a legal thou shalt not, but more about the whole like fabric of their society and what was expected when two people wanted to build a life together.
Yeah, exactly. And what's wild is that back then, these social customs held a lot of weight, like more than we might think today. We tend to put so much emphasis on written laws. But back then, the unwritten rules, the traditions that everyone just kind of knew and followed, those were hugely influential in shaping how people acted, especially when it came to something as important as marriage and starting a family. The article emphasizes that you can't really understand the unspoken expectations around sex and relationships unless you understand those customs.
You're right. And when you actually look at the laws in the Old Testament that do deal with sex, like the ones you find in Leviticus 18, which talk about things like incest, having sex during a woman's period, adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, it's pretty noticeable that premarital sex isn't on that list.
Right. And the article actually tries to explain why that might be, which I thought was really thought-provoking. Think about it. In those ancient cultures, there wasn't any reliable birth control. And a woman's security, like her whole future, basically, both financially and socially, was super dependent on getting married. So, in a way, sex was almost automatically linked with marriage in people's minds. It was just kind of assumed that those two things went together. So maybe it seemed like a separate law against premarital sex was kind of redundant, like it was already built into the whole way society worked.
Okay, that makes sense when you think about it in their context. But the article does bring up this one passage in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 28, where it talks about a man having sex with an unmarried woman who isn't engaged. And in that case, he's required to marry her. So what's that telling us about how they thought about sex?
So think about this. Even though it doesn't explicitly forbid sex before marriage, this law still says a lot about what was considered the right place for sex, I mean, the fact that there's this legal requirement to get married in that specific situation really highlights that having sex outside of marriage had consequences. It was definitely seen as not okay, as like going off the path from what you were supposed to do. It's almost like the law is stepping in to fix what went wrong when the two people had sex outside of marriage.
And then there's that other part in Deuteronomy, still chapter 22, but verses 13 through 21, that's even more intense. It's about a husband accusing his new wife of not being a virgin. And the article points out that in this scenario, having sex before marriage is basically treated the same way as if the woman had already been married to someone else. And the penalty is just as harsh as if she had committed adultery. I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement about what they expected, right?
Yeah, and it makes you think about how much value they put on a woman being a virgin when she got married, right? I mean, that passage really drives home the point that a woman's sexual history was not a small thing back then. It was so important that if she wasn't a virgin, it could lead to some pretty serious accusations and even punishment. It shows you how deeply ingrained that expectation of sexual purity before marriage was in their culture.
The article also talks about Genesis 2.24, the part about the creation of Eve. It focuses on the order of events. First, a man leaves his family, then he cleaves to his wife, and only then do they become one flesh. And the article suggests that this is like a basic pattern, a foundation for how they understood marriage and sex.
Mhm.
You have the commitment, and then you have the intimacy.
Right, that order is super important. Leaving and cleaving come before the one flesh part. And what's cool is that the article makes this connection to the language you hear in some wedding ceremonies, like in the Church of England, where they talk about how the physical union of the couple actually makes their emotional and spiritual bond even stronger. So it's like the physical part is meant to be this like beautiful culmination of a commitment that's already there, the creation of this brand new unit, this husband and wife who are now one.
Okay, so now let's move on to the New Testament. The article points out that we still don't see any direct mentions of things like living together before marriage or having sex before marriage, but there is a lot of talk about avoiding something called porneia, which is often translated as like fornication or sexual immorality, both in what Jesus taught and what Paul wrote. So what does porneia actually mean? What does it cover?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the truth is, even scholars who study the Bible really closely still debate exactly what porneia meant back in the first century. I mean, we're talking about different cultures, different languages, a whole different world, really. The article makes a pretty strong case that porneia would have included sex before marriage based on what we know about how Jewish people understood things back then. But there are other interpretations out there, too.
Okay, so it's not a simple thing to define.
Not at all. But the article argues that for Jesus and Paul, porneia would definitely have included all those things we talked about that were forbidden in Leviticus 18, like incest and adultery. But here's the interesting part for you. The way Jewish people at the time understood porneia might have been even broader than that. Some scholars think they saw it as basically any kind of sexual activity that happened outside of a marriage between a man and a woman. So that would mean that, yeah, premarital sex would be included in that.
And the article even uses the Greek translation of Deuteronomy 22.21, the one about the husband accusing his wife, as evidence for this. Because in that Greek translation, they use a word that comes from the same root as porneia to talk about the woman being promiscuous.
Right. And that connection is important
Mm.
because it suggests that the way porneia was understood back then went beyond just a few specific acts. It was more about like the whole context of where sex was supposed to happen. So putting all these pieces together, the article concludes that when you read the New Testament and it talks about avoiding sexual immorality, which is how they usually translate porneia, you should understand that as including sex before marriage and living together before marriage, not just things like adultery, even though those are the things that are specifically mentioned. It's like you need to see those New Testament writings through the lens of how people in the first century actually understood these terms.
Gotcha. So the article then dives into Paul's advice in 1 Corinthians 7. This is where he basically says that each man should have his own wife and each woman should have her own husband. And he presents this as a solution to the problem of porneia happening among people who aren't married yet. So how does this passage shed light on the whole issue of sex before marriage?
So the key here is to pay attention to the specific situation that Paul is addressing. He's talking about porneia happening among people who are single. And his solution to that is for everyone to be married. So what's that telling you? It seems pretty likely that the porneia he's worried about in this case is, in fact, premarital sex. I mean, why else would he say that everyone should get married as a way to stop it, right?
Yeah.
It suggests that Paul, like a lot of people in that time, saw marriage as the proper and intended place for sexual intimacy to happen, and that having sex outside of that context was a problem.
Oh, okay, so we're seeing some consistency between the Old and New Testaments here, even if it's not always super explicit.
Definitely. Now, the article also gets into this idea of what they call biblical anthropology, which is a bit of a fancy term. But basically, it's about how the Bible understands human beings, like what it means to be a person. And the article emphasizes that the Bible sees humans as whole beings, not just physical bodies, but also with souls or spirits. It's like our physical and spiritual sides are totally connected. And this has a lot to do with how they thought about sex, too.
Right. So it's not just about the physical act itself, it's about the whole person and the whole relationship. So, how does this whole person view connect to what we've been talking about with sex before marriage?
Well, what's interesting here is that the article is suggesting that the way we act, especially with our bodies, should match up with our inner selves, like our beliefs, our commitments, our promises. And they apply this to sex specifically. So the idea is that because sex involves this total physical giving of yourself to another person, it should really only happen within a relationship that also involves a total lifelong commitment. And that's what marriage is supposed to be, right? The article suggests that when what we do with our bodies doesn't line up with what's going on inside us, when those two things are out of sync, it can cause a lot of pain and make us feel broken or incomplete in a way. It's like there's this dissonance between what we're doing and who we are.
So, it's all about aligning the external and the internal. That's really interesting. Now, the discussion in the article then shifts to a broader perspective, looking at the impact of things like living together and casual sex on society as a whole. And they bring in this argument from Mark Regnerus, who wrote this book called Cheap Sex. Can you summarize what Regnerus is saying, like how the article presents his view?
Sure. So what the article is getting at here is that throughout history, marriage, especially for women, has often involved this kind of trade-off. Like women were often looking for security and commitment from a man, and men were often looking for, well, sex. And marriage kind of formalized that
Yeah.
exchange, right? But Regnerus argues that now that sex is happening more and more outside of marriage, the whole dynamic has gotten messed up. And this might be putting women at a disadvantage, at least in some ways.
So it's like the traditional deal has changed.
Exactly. The article explains that Regnerus is saying that in the past, there was this sort of unspoken agreement that men would pay for sex, so to speak, by offering women the security and stability of marriage, which a lot of women wanted. But now, with more sex happening outside of marriage, men can kind of get what they want without necessarily having to make that same level of commitment. And this has led to some consequences, particularly for women. The article even points to studies that show that couples who live together before getting married are actually more likely to get divorced later on. And of course, when relationships break down, it's often women and children who bear the brunt of that. For example, in the UK, something like 90% of single parents are women.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like shifting the whole foundation of how relationships work, and it's bound to have ripple effects, right? So the article wraps up this section by emphasizing that sex, even though it's a good thing, a gift from God, is also really powerful. And it has this potential to bring both great joy and also a lot of pain and damage. And the article suggests that this might be why Jesus and Paul talked about sex so much.
Yeah, I mean, you think about how often they bring it up. It really shows you how central it is to how we live and how we relate to each other. The potential for this deep, amazing connection is right there alongside the potential for getting hurt and hurting others. And because it's so powerful, the article implies, it needs to be handled carefully. And the biblical perspective seems to be that the safest, most fulfilling place for sex is within the commitment of marriage.
That's a good point. Okay, so in the last part of the article, it talks about how churches in the West are having a hard time addressing these issues today. So, what are some of the challenges the article brings up?
So the main thing is just how quickly our culture is changing, and churches haven't always kept up. The article says that in the past, churches maybe didn't talk about sex and relationships as openly and clearly as they could have, and now, with all these rapid changes happening, people's opinions and beliefs are changing fast too. And that can lead to a lot of tension and make it really difficult for churches to even start a conversation about these things, let alone figure out how to address them in a way that's helpful and relevant.
Yeah, it's like there's this gap between what the church has traditionally taught and what people are actually experiencing and thinking about today.
Exactly. And because there wasn't a lot of clear teaching in the past, it's like there's this vacuum now.
Yeah.
And that makes it even harder to navigate all these complex issues around sex and relationships.
Okay, and at the very end, the author of the article mentions that he wrote a booklet called What is Sex For? And he explains that in the booklet, he's trying to approach the whole conversation in a different way by starting with positive statements about sex, like how it's a good thing, a gift from God, and how it's supposed to be enjoyed within the context of marriage.
And I think that's a really important thing to highlight. It's not just about what you can't do. It's about understanding the beauty and the purpose of sex within a committed relationship. So instead of just saying, don't do this, don't do that, The booklet tries to create this bigger, more positive picture of what sex is all about. And hopefully that makes it easier to understand why the Bible might discourage things like sex before marriage, because it's not about taking something good away from people. It's about helping them experience it in the best, most fulfilling way possible.
I like that approach. Okay, and then there's this section at the end of the article where the author shares some of the comments that people left after reading it. And wow, there are a lot of different opinions and perspectives in there. What were some of the main themes that came up in those comments?
It's super fascinating, actually. It really shows you how people are wrestling with all of this,
Right.
how they're trying to make sense of these ancient texts and apply them to our modern world, which is so different in a lot of ways. And one of the big things that people were talking about is the very definition of marriage. Like, what does it actually mean to be married? Is it just a legal thing, like a contract you signed with the government? Or is it more than that? Does it have to involve your community, your families, like it did in ancient Israel? And that brings up the whole question of historical context, how marriage worked back then compared to how it works now.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge. Like, if we're trying to figure out what the Bible says about sex and marriage, we have to understand what marriage actually meant to the people who wrote and read those texts, right?
Exactly. And some people in the comments were also debating the main question. Does the Bible actually say no to premarital sex in a clear, straightforward way? Some argue that it didn't need to because the social norms back then already made it pretty obvious that it wasn't okay. But then others were like, well, if that's the case, why are there specific rules against other things that were probably just as common back then? It's a good question. And of course, there was a lot of discussion about porneia again, with people interpreting the New Testament passages in different ways. Some felt strongly that it definitely includes premarital sex, while others weren't so sure. They brought up examples from the Old Testament, too, like that passage in Deuteronomy about the woman being stoned if she wasn't a virgin when she got married, which is a pretty extreme example.
Yeah. Heavy stuff. And the article also mentions that some of the commenters brought up the fact that we live in a totally different world now. People are waiting longer to get married, contraception is readily available, and our culture is just so saturated with sex. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't escape it, right? It's everywhere. And so they were questioning whether the same rules that applied back then still make sense today, or if we need to find new ways of thinking about all this.
And that's a really important conversation to have. It's not about just throwing the Bible out the window, but it is about recognizing that our context is vastly different, and we need to be thoughtful about how we apply these ancient teachings to our lives today. And what really stood out to me was that some of the comments shared really personal struggles too, like how to navigate dating and relationships after a divorce, or what it means to be committed to someone without being officially married. And those real-life experiences add a whole other level of complexity to these discussions.
It's not just theoretical anymore, right? It's people's lives.
Exactly. Oh, and some people brought up other verses from the Bible too, like Hebrews 13.4, which talks about the marriage bed being undefiled, and 1 Corinthians 7.2, where Paul says that to avoid immorality, everyone should have their own spouse.
Hmm.
So there are definitely more pieces to the puzzle.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive here, what are some of the key things we can take away from all this? It seems like there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple issue, but I think what becomes clear is that even though the Bible doesn't have a big, bold-lettered rule that says thou shalt not have sex before marriage, when you look at everything together, like the social customs of the Old Testament, how they understood porneia in the New Testament, and how the Bible views us as whole people, body and soul, it does point pretty strongly to this idea that sex was meant to be experienced within the commitment of marriage. It was part of that whole package, that covenant between a man and a woman.
And it's important to remember that how we interpret these texts and how we apply them to our lives today is still up for debate. I mean, the article shows that, and the comments definitely show that. There's no one easy answer that everyone agrees on. It's something that people of faith are still wrestling with, and that's okay.
Absolutely. And it brings up some really important questions for all of us. How do these historical and theological perspectives inform our own views on intimacy and commitment? And how do we, as a modern society, engage with these ancient teachings in a way that's both respectful and relevant to our lives? And those are tough questions, but they're worth asking.
For sure. So, for everyone listening, if you want to explore all this in more depth, we definitely recommend checking out the full article by Ian Paul over on Suffizo. And if you're interested in digging even deeper into his perspective, his booklet, What is Sex For? Sounds like a great resource, too. It might also be a great starting point for conversations with your friends, your family, your faith community, whoever you want to talk to about this stuff.
Exactly. And to leave you with one last thing to think about, we live in a world where the whole idea of marriage is changing, right? People are defining it differently, thinking about its purpose differently. So that raises another question. Are there some fundamental principles about sex and relationships that still hold true, regardless of how marriage evolves? And if so, what are those principles and why are they still important today? It's something to ponder, for sure.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for diving into this with me.
It's been a pleasure, as always.